Okay, Shamik, great. Nice to meet you. How are you doing?
You too. Very well, thank you. Coping just about.
So first of all, could you kind of introduce yourself and kind of describe what it is that you do as chief economist?
Yeah, sure. So I'm chief economist at an organisation called BNY Mellon Investment Management. BNY Mellon is a big American bank that owns an investment management company, BNY Mellon Investment Management. And it's a slightly odd company, and the bank owns a bunch of different investment management companies, such as Insight and Newton. And my job really is to provide the sort of macroeconomic backgrounds, the macroeconomic analysis on which those guys can base their investment decisions, but also the company as a whole can sell their investment products more effectively. That's basically what I do, and it's a global. So it's not just UK. It's a global sort of economic outlook that I do.
Great, yeah. And so, like, I guess one of the particularly sort of pertinent questions involved in that kind of work at the moment is obviously everything going on. I'm sure you saw this kind of question coming. With everything going on with coronavirus. So one of the questions that someone at Pembroke wanted to ask is how I've seen talk that you've done in Minsk, for example, about sort of rising globalization, and so I've done my research, and so I guess one of the questions was how do we kind of aggregate sort of international economic efforts during times like this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the first thing to recognise is that coronavirus is unprecedented. It's probably the biggest economic shock we've suffered in at least 100 years. Moreover, it's international. It's affecting everyone, and you know, by its very nature, therefore, it's not something that you can avoid by going to one country or another. So. The first thing to remember is that this is a global shock, not one that hits just a group of countries. In fairness, in times gone past, I think there would have been a much more, because of that, there would have been a much more globally coordinated reaction. A bit like the reaction we had after the financial crisis back in 2008. You and your guys are too young to remember that, I'm sure. But back then, what happened was that the big sort of multilateral organizations like the IMF, the G7, the G20, they got together quickly and they worked out a fairly coordinated response across countries. Funnily enough, this time around, it's been much more country-specific, nation-state based, if you like, reaction. We've all, broadly speaking, ended up in very similar places, but that's not because we've sort of asked each other or coordinated that. It's because that's been the way that where individual countries have converged over time. So it's been quite a different response in some ways to what happened after the financial crisis.
Yeah, so I guess like where it's such a kind of immediate kind of response to have been taken, it's kind of it kind of brings out a lot of the differences, but also a lot of the similarities in which countries have to respond, I suppose.
Yeah, and look, I'm not saying this is anything. I'm not saying there's anything terribly wrong with what's happened. It's just something that I note that it's been very sort of individual, nation state, country based rather than internationally coordinated. And that reflects, I think, a lot of changes that have happened in the 10 years since the global financial crisis. It's been broadly speaking, it's been a world in which we're getting a bit less interlinked, a bit less globalized. I don't want to overplay that, but it's certainly the case that the international institutions maybe aren't playing the role that certainly people of my generation got used to them playing in the 20th century. But yeah, I mean, as I say, in the end, we've kind of converged on, broadly speaking, the same kind of approach everywhere, which involves some combination of testing, tracing, and lockdown to prevent the spread.
Okay, that's super interesting. So I also saw while I was preparing a publication that you did for BNY Mellon, I think, for like your kind of predictions for the outcomes of coronavirus, and you outlined various different like models, like the U-shaped kind of recovery, V-shape, and L-shape as well as a couple of others. And I just wondered if you could A, maybe explain those a little bit, and B, also, given that we've kind of run a bit further down the timeline, and also we've seen a bit more of some of the kind of some of the delayed response, for example, with the like distribution of PPE in the United Kingdom, for example. So I guess, yeah, could you firstly explain those kind of,
Sure,
well,
yeah.
at least a little bit, and then maybe if they've changed at all?
Yeah, sure, will do. Well, but first off, again, quality research on your part. You guys are obviously much better at digging into the detail than I was when I was your age. So the first thing to say is that, following on from what I said before, is that what we've got baked in, if you like, to the first half of this year is a massive economic contraction, not just in the UK, but around the world. And that's baked in, and there's very, very little governments can do about it. Quite the contrary, in a way, recession is an inevitable repercussion from lockdown, and lockdown is fundamentally a public health policy. It's designed to keep the infection from spreading, and therefore, and from overwhelming our health services. And therefore, in a way, recession is a public health policy in itself. And some of the numbers are truly scary. We could see the UK economy shrink by, say, 30% in the second quarter. That's just an extraordinary number, right? An absolutely extraordinary number. I mean, the US economy may shrink by about 10 to 15. The world economy as a whole could shrink by about 10% in the second quarter of this year. And that's completely unprecedented. If you think about it, in the worst quarter of the financial crisis, which was the last time we had anything big, the biggest loss in global GDP was about 4%. So this is massive, but it's baked in. So your question is really about what happens from now. And yes, we kind of drew up a bit of a kind of alphabet soup about the way the economy could go from here. We talked about a V-shaped recovery. So a V-shaped recovery is one where you get a really big sharp drop, like the one I've talked about in the second quarter, but you get a pretty big bounce back in the second half of the year, and maybe going into 2021 as well. We also talked about a U-shaped recovery where you get a big fall, but it takes some time to get the economy going again. And, things don't really pick up until 2021. Within the U-shaped recovery, I'd also include something we've called a W-shaped recovery, actually, which is where, maybe the economy bounces back, but then comes back again and goes through a series of iterations. And finally, there's an L-shaped recovery, or as some of my colleagues describe it, a kind of Nike swoosh shaped recovery, where you get a big drop, and then it takes quite some time to get back to where we started from. What distinguishes those three things? Well, fundamentally, it's going to be the course of the disease itself. Right? So if we can get the disease under control, if we can keep the reproduction number R less than 1, maintain a degree of social distancing, and keep our health services from being overwhelmed by a second wave, then a V-shape seems reasonably likely, it seems to me. However, if we do get a second wave, and or we have to reintroduce lockdown, then you're talking about a U or a W. And then finally, if the lockdown continues for so long that you get massive capital destruction, lots of bankruptcies, and you permanently impact, if you like, the supply capacity of the economy, then that's the kind of world in which you're likely to get an L, it seems to me, or this reverse Nike swoosh, where productive capacity is hit hard. We talked, when we published that document that you so skillfully found, we talked about probabilities of roughly 35% each on the V and the U, and 20% on the L. We're kind of still there, but I have to say my team and lots of people around me are shifting further towards the U, simply because they think social distancing measures will continue to hobble the economy for quite some time. We'll finalize those new probabilities in about a couple of weeks' time, but that's broadly speaking where the nature of our thinking is developing. I personally still think a V is reasonably likely as well. Can I just say one more thing about this alphabet soup as well? And a lot of people don't get this, but I'm sure you guys will get it straight away. Is that it's going to be, in some ways, it's going to be quite difficult to distinguish a V from a U. So, for instance, imagine the UK economy does shrink by 30% in the second quarter. As I said, that's a huge number. And imagine so that's roughly a third, okay? And then of that third that we've shut down, imagine only a third of that opens up in the third quarter. So you've had a 30% fall, or a fall of a third, and then a third of that we've lost opens up. Now, what we'll see in the official numbers is a fall of about 30% in GDP in Q2, but we'll see a rise of about 14% in Q3. Now, that still only gets you back to, you're still 2/3 down on where you were, where you started from. But that 14% will look like quite a strong number, and some people will call that a V, even though it's a U.
Right. So I guess we've got to be really careful and kind of measured about how we trace the kind of exactly. The way that we recover.
Precisely that is.
That's really insightful. So I guess perhaps more on a more positive note, looking after sort of post coronavirus, do you think what sort of economic perhaps challenges might we face in the future, given the kind of current political climate? But what other things do we perhaps maybe have to look forward to as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. So look, I think that longer term, the truth is, and we don't know, right? You know, this is such a huge shock, and economists don't often enough say we don't know. But the truth is we don't know, and it's very uncertain. But having said that, I think, you know, I'm focusing on kind of 4 things that might come out of this. And the 4 things focus basically on geopolitics, on the nature of globalization, on the nature of work, and finally, the prospects for you guys, for youngsters. I think those things are, you know, this is hugely speculative, but if we start with the geopolitics, I think, in fact, actually, in all 4 of these cases, what this does is accelerate trends that were in place anyway. So, like I said before, there'd been in the past 10 years this trend towards what you might call geopolitical fracturing. So clearly, the relationship between the US and China was changing. We've seen the rise of, if you like, strongman politics around the world. And, you know, the sort of multilateral, rules-based, international, institution-based system that I grew up with has been fraying for some time. And I think COVID will just accelerate that. We've seen that it's been a very nation-state-based response. Plus, there's a lot of fur flying at the moment between the US and China, which I suspect will only get worse. And over time, that will essentially cause people on a range of issues, cause countries effectively to have to take sides. So we might get a much more bipolar world than we've had in the past. That's geopolitical fracturing. That geopolitical fracturing also means, because the relationship between the US and China is changing, the basic structure of the world economy is likely to change. These hugely elongated supply chains that we've got used to having. You know, you order something on Amazon and basically it arrives almost instantaneously, usually from China. That's probably going to change. I don't think we'll see a huge change in Amazon delivery times, but what you might find is that supply chains shrink, they become much more local, and or more likely they diversify, i.e. away from China. We'll start to see, you know, countries looking to source supply from elsewhere. And that can have big repercussions. It might be more costly in the short run to do that. So that's another repercussion. The third one is the world of work and automation. Because supply chains will shrink, because we'll be sourcing stuff from elsewhere, because costs will be rising, there'll be a bigger incentive, if you like, to replace cheap labor in the rest of the world with machines, essentially, in the West. So that's going to continue. And then finally, the prospects for you guys. I mean, it's been pretty tough on anyone really born between, you know, arguably all Gen Zers. You know, anyone born after 2000 will have had to experience not one but two major economic crises, whereas people of my generation or slightly older probably went through very few, or at least nothing on the scale that we have. And that affects your income prospects, it affects your outlook on life, it affects the way you deal with each other. And all of that is going to be challenging, but here's where I'm optimistic. This generation is also much more interconnected, much more tech savvy, much more entrepreneurial, I think, than generations that have gone before. And therefore, even though they will be big challenges, I suspect we'll find this generation rising to it very successfully.
So hopefully not all to despair over.
No, there'll be good stuff in there, believe me.
That's great. So to end, hopefully on a slightly simpler and overall more positive tone, could you perhaps recall back to your time studying at Oxford and at Pembroke, and maybe think of some maybe good lessons that you learnt while studying, or maybe some fond memories that you had?
Well, look, I had a fantastic time at Pembroke. It's the 3 happiest years of my life still, and I hope that will be the case for you and your cohorts as well, once we get over this temporary disruption. I still have lots and lots of friends from Pembroke. I still in touch with maybe 20, 30 people on a regular basis, which is testament to how close we were. Pembroke was pretty insular back then, but I liked that. It meant you get to know lots of people very, very well. I didn't really do a huge amount in the university itself, and that includes going to lectures. So that's not an example you should follow. But what I do remember is a very tight-knit, very socially responsible, very politically aware group of people who spent a lot of time enjoying themselves as well, making sure that they studied hard, but they kind of formed friendships and relationships that would last, and they did that very, very successfully. And Pembroke is really, it's something about the physical geography of it, maybe the traditions that it has. I'm really hoping that sort of camaraderie is still there, and I'm pretty sure it is.
I think it is too.
Good. That's really good to hear. Just on kind of the sort of political awareness point, I know that diversity was one of the themes that I think you wanted to talk about. We were always very aware of that issue. It wasn't called that back then, but broadly speaking, the student body back then was very aware of improving access by social class, by gender, and also by ethnicity. We probably could and should have made more progress in the intervening years, but I hope and I understand that still is a concern for the current student body, but also the staff members there as well. So here's to you guys, and to Pembroke's future. It means a huge amount to me. And the main thing is that once this awful situation is over, you get back and start partying hard in between the studying as well.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you so much for talking.
Not at all.
And I wish you well in such strange times.
Well, I wish you all well too. It must be very difficult for you, but it will get better.
Thank you.